Welcome to Conversations of Hope, a podcast that shines light into the darkness of childhood sexual abuse. I am your host, Faith Ingraham of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I am Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. We are both survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and we're sharing our healing journey to raise awareness and provide hope and support to other survivors.
We know what it's like to feel all alone with our secrets, but we also know what it's like to find freedom. We are breaking the silence that allows sexual abuse to thrive and using our voices to empower and encourage those who have experienced abuse.
Our goal is to create a safe space for survivors to find hope and healing in community. Thank you for joining us.
Last time we were talking about the impact that abuse has on our relationships. And today we are actually going to have our first guests on our podcast. And we've invited our husbands to talk about how abuse impacted our relationship with them by their perspective. So today we have my husband, Dale Ingraham, here today, and also Michelle will introduce her husband.
Yes, this is my husband, Anthony Viscuse.
And so, as you guys know, we've been talking about the impacts of abuse and how it impacted our relationship. And we'd like you guys to just discuss how it has impacted our relationship from your viewpoint.
So I'll go ahead and jump in and just share a little bit kind of about our story from my perspective, going all the way back to Bible college. Faith and I met in Bible college. I graduated in 83 and Faith graduated in 84. So she was a year behind me. And I remember when we started dating that there always seemed like there was a wall kind of in between us. You know, we would date and we were interested in each other. And I was pursuing her more than she was pursuing me, but I could tell there was something there that just seemed like it was a block. And I even remember talking with a friend of mine, and we actually brought up the possibility that maybe Faith had been abused, but Faith and I had never talked about it. And when it got to the point where we were talking about getting engaged, Faith needed to tell me what she had been through. And I remember the night very well. It was horrific for her. She cried the hardest that night than she's ever cried, even to this day. I could tell that it was gut-wrenching for her. And I don't believe that night that she told me it was her father that had sexually abused her. She didn't go into a lot of details. She would share bits and pieces, which I think is fairly normal for abuse survivors. They don't just share everything at once. And eventually she told me it was her father that had abused her, and he was a pastor the whole time. So that process of working through it, I remember telling Faith that I still viewed her as a virgin, and I viewed her as innocent. This was something that was done to her. And I know that, you know, as husbands, Anthony, and I'm looking forward to hearing your story as well on this, but as husbands whose wives have been abused, you see a lot of times you'll see they kind of are closed up and maybe feel shame. And I always felt it was important to let Faith know that I always viewed her as innocent, which God does. Matthew 18, the first 14 verses, God lays the blame of abuse at the feet of the offender, not the feet of the victim or the child. So eventually Faith and I got married after she graduated. I started pastoring a church in October of 1983. We were engaged when I had my first church. We got married. We didn't talk a lot about the abuse, but it was obvious that it was a major issue. Now, this is the part where I had not been taught anything about abuse from the church in a Bible school setting. I graduated from a Christian school. Nobody talked about abuse. So I didn't know what to expect, even though I knew Faith had been abused. And at that point, I knew she had been abused by her father. I didn't know for how many years it had lasted. I didn't know if it was just molestation. I say just, that's just as horrific, but molestation, rape, I didn't know the extent of the abuse. But it was obvious that when it came to sex and intimacy, it was a struggle. It was difficult for Faith. And I think as men, even Christian men, we have a lot of misconceptions about sex and its role in marriage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, as we go along, either in this podcast or in part two. But I just know in our marriage, we would from time to time talk about the abuse, but not in depth, just kind of in passing and realizing, okay, it's obviously impacting how we interact with each other. We had a good marriage. We've had a good relationship. We have 5 children. Faith was always a loving mom and a caring mom and wife. And as a pastor, I've pastored 3 churches since 83. The first one I pastored in the 80s. The second would be in the 90s. And then the third one was from 2000 to 2020. And now we do our ministry full time. But as a pastor, I'm up front preaching. And up until 2006, I'm not talking about abuse either. So I'm doing kind of everything that I get after other pastors for not doing. I was doing the same thing up until 2006. It was when, and I'm sure Faith has shared the story already in the podcast, but when her father molested one of her nieces, that's what really woke us up in 2006. And that's when I sat down with Faith, and I was going to confront Dad with what he had just done to Faith's niece. And I was going to go with 2 of Faith's brothers. It was late November of 2006. And I sat down with Faith before I left the house, and I said, I'm going to confront Dad for the first time with what he did to you years ago, not what he had just done. And I said, I need to know more. And that's when I found out that the abuse had lasted from the time she was 9 or so until 18. Then it was molestation. It was rape. So the full weight really settled in that night. And I went to confront him. And I'll never forget when I walked into the house with Faith's 2 brothers, Dad sat over on the couch opposite the door we came in. And he's sitting on the couch with an open Bible on his left. And he puts his left hand over on the Bible just as we're actually entering into the house. We don't even have our coats off yet. And he starts talking about all the stuff God's teaching him, and he's been reading his Bible, and he's just going on and on about this stuff. And I stopped him. I interrupted him. And I said, we have some things we need to talk to you about. And I said, the first thing we're going to do is have a word of prayer. And so one of the Pace brothers prayed, and then we took turns confronting Dad with what he had done. I confronted him with what he had done to Faith. He was very dismissive of that, 2 sides to every story. And it was obvious, he was not repentant at all or remorseful for what he had done. He just wanted us to believe he was already right with God. And so we could just, life could just go on. And unfortunately, that's what often happens still in the church setting, is when offenders are exposed, that the church just lets them apologize, make a simple acknowledgement, and, quote, confess their sin. And then everything just kind of goes back to normal. Just hit the reset button. And then the church is oblivious to the fact that the abuse doesn't stop. They may move from one victim to another, but it doesn't stop. The offender usually has many victims, and it just goes from one victim to the other. So that's a little bit about our story. We have a great marriage, but, sex, intimacy is still a struggle. But marriage is a lot deeper than that. I think one of the mistakes that's happening in Christian marriages is this idea that sex is like the most important experience within the marriage, and it's not. It is something beautiful. It's something God designed. God planned it. And of course, this and we have to bring this in, abuse itself, it's like the perfect scenario for Satan. He comes in to do harm to the individual child, and that it impacts them for their whole life. Now they can find healing, and Jesus is the ultimate healer. Um, but that doesn't mean that you're not dealing with it. It's a process that I think an abuse survivor faces their whole life. And people that are in their 80s and 90s, when Faith has a chance to share her testimony in churches, it's incredible. You'll get men and women will come up with tears in their eyes, and they will say things to her after the service like, "I went through that as well," or "I know what you went through," and you can tell by the look in their eyes and the tears that they went through abuse, and for the most part, they probably never told anybody. So abuse does profoundly impact marriage, not just in the sexual relationship. It seems to be the one when there's two or three guys together and we're just talking and they feel open enough to share a little bit. Sex may seem like the biggest thing to them that is impacted, but there are much deeper issues than that. Communication, trust, your own relationship with each other, the friendship, and how close you are as individuals. Those are really the more important issues. And I think that as you have a chance to work through those issues, which is why it's really important for the abuse survivor. And let's keep in mind too, that statistics show that as far as women being abused, it's somewhere between 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 4 girls raped or molested by the time they're 18. But let's keep in mind with the guys, some of the studies show it's 1 in 6. There's some that show it's 1 in 10, but that's incredible, the amount of people that have gone through sexual abuse. And so there's a lot of men in marriage who've never told their wife that they've been through abuse. And so that does profoundly impact the dynamics between the husband and wife. And we'll get into some maybe more specifics here in a little bit, but maybe Anthony, you can share a little bit about your story.
Yeah, thank you, Dale and Faith and Michelle for having me on. And so I hear a lot of similar things as your story, Dale. And Michelle and I met, we dated for several years. And then, of course, we got married in 2000. And there was a dynamic that existed, I could tell. Michelle had shared with me things about her past where she had some difficult relationships, rocky points in her life, ups and downs. But I did not hear the full story until, as she shared in a different podcast, when she was in counseling and her counselor and her had been talking about sharing her full history with me. And so I didn't hear about her full story and what had happened to her and the extent and who was involved with that until much later in our marriage when we had children, when she was able to, in the end, confront her accuser and really find a sense of freedom and begin a journey of healing. So, but there are some similar things that I've heard from your story there that I experienced with just points in our relationship, whether it was through intimacy or just as we went through life, where there would just be times where we didn't feel like we were on the same wavelength, or something would be, I'd look at Michelle or talk to Michelle and see like something would be bothering her. As I'm learning now, I'm learning about a lot of this. There are points in her life where there's trigger points where she's involved in something that brings memories back and hurts. And those are times where she might be not herself. And so I've had to learn and adjust to those things. And it's made me a better person to begin understanding those things and show some empathy to her. So there's a lot of similar things. There's some different things. I mean, we're in the midst of raising young children. All our kids were very young when Michelle was going through counseling and really coming to grips with all the things that had happened in her past and the hurts that she had and ways she was learning to heal from those. And so we were really in the midst of busy life. And so there were times where we probably, it would have benefited us to have a little bit more quiet time to maybe mush through those things together. but life just was in full bore with the kids and all the activities, the things we were doing, the job and the business and all. So, but yeah, a lot of the same similarities. And um, uh, I can say this: Michelle is a strong human being. She is one of the strongest women I've ever met in my life, and so I'm extremely proud of her and the way she's handled this journey and the way God's worked in her life and the maturity that she has and now the ministry she has through this that you guys have and through her Journey Pink ministry and the way she's able to minister and support women and men who have gone through this. And I've tried to do my best to be a helpmate to her in that regard, but it is a difficult situation, as you mentioned, Dale. It's one that the general public certainly does not want to talk about and deal with, and it's one, unfortunately, that the church itself does not want to deal with, and so that's really the unfortunate thing of it. But I can see how God has worked in her life, of course, in my life, our life together, the way it's impacted our family, our children, the knowledge and awareness that it's brought in helping to understand how this really affects someone, not just in the moment, but as you mentioned, when Faith or Michelle has shared with women's groups, women in their 80s that can still remember how that has impacted them through their whole life, and so it never ends. It's something you deal with and have to continue to grow with and heal with, and so I'm in a sense happy to be a part of that journey with Michelle, and it's helped me to become a better person. Um, but there are a lot of similarities, and I'm just so proud of the way she's taken this on and the way that God's worked in her and through others in trying to tackle this. The introduction to the podcast says bringing light into areas where sexual abuse has thrived, and we know that that's what Jesus wants us to do. Every time we bring Jesus or God into the conversation and make people more aware, it just provides less of an opportunity for that abuse to occur, less of an opportunity for the darkness to flourish. And that's what God wants ultimately. I think that's what we all strive for as human beings, is to have great relationships. And we have really grown through this, and it's brought us closer together. And so, yeah, it's great being on and being able to talk about this. It's funny in all the years we've been together and since this issue has come into our lives and we've kind of confronted it together and grown with it, it's not something I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of men about or even other people about. It's just such a difficult subject to talk about, but it is one that we need to talk about.
Yeah, I picked up on a word you said. You used the word journey there a few times. And I was just thinking that, as well, both men and women, the husband and the wife, when you're thinking about getting married and you get married, you kind of have your vision of what the journey is going to look like. Your dream for the marriage and the children and the home and all that kind of stuff. But when abuse is thrown in the mix, in still probably in the vast majority of marriages, when the husband and wife get married, they have no idea that their mate's been abused. In most cases, they haven't talked about it. So it comes up at some point in marriage, and then you realize you're on a different journey than what you had planned. But what's interesting, Anthony, and I would say this, this is something for the guys that are going to watch this eventually, that, okay, so maybe it's not the journey you planned. And the same for the wife. But if you look at this and say, okay, this is a reality we have to deal with. And even though healing is often a painful process, but the journey has its own rewards. It becomes something very special. And I think, like for Faith and myself, I been a pastor since '83, and Faith was always very involved in ministry, but was always behind the scenes. We weren't like a team doing it together. She did a ton of stuff behind the scenes. I was the guy that did the preaching. She was like the brains behind the outfit. What's really neat about, kind of our journey now in with having this ministry, Faith and I do almost everything together. So when we're teaching most of our presentations, we do it together, which is just really neat. It's something we would have never experienced if we hadn't dealt with what she had gone through and dealt with the painful stuff. We're doing something now that if we just stayed on the same journey or the same track of kind of ignoring the abuse, doing the pastor thing, um, we would have completely missed out on. So I think it's something that couples are going to have to embrace. If this is something that they've been impacted by, the husband, the wife, some cases it's both. And so they both have a lot of brokenness they've got to go through and do some healing on. And I would say to the, couples that are watching this, that if you've got issues in your marriage, like right now, yeah, you're going to work on some of those present issues, but you're not going to be successful working through those present issues unless you really go back and deal with the abuse that either one of you have been through or both of you have been through. You need to find some healing there before you're going to find some, effective healing with some of the more surface issues you're dealing with, whether it's communication or whatever it might be. And I think for the men whose wife has been through abuse, probably one of the biggest steps, maybe the first step or most important step, try to get to a place where you're beginning to understand what they've been through. On an experiential level, you can't, right? Unless you go through it. But in terms of, Peter talked about, considering your wife, getting to know her. On that level, you can much better understand what she's gone through. And you have to start there to begin to understand the impact. Faith and Michelle have been talking about the impact of abuse throughout the podcasts on themselves. And now we're talking about the impact of abuse on marriage. But the husband's got to start there to begin to understand the enormity. This is not just some simple thing that happened and now she should just get over it kind of thing. When people say stuff like that, they don't understand. So I think you've got to start there. Anthony, you mentioned empathy. As husbands, it's really important that we have compassion for our wife. I mean, if we can't, cry, shed some tears for what they went through, just for them, forget about ourselves for a minute, what they went through as a child and how horrific that was. And there are just so many different layers of pain and abuse. If it happens to be a parent that's abusing you or a pastor that's abusing you, all of those add different complications and more pain and more difficulties. And I think as husbands, it's important that we try to understand. And it doesn't happen with one meeting, sitting down, listening to them one evening, and okay, now I'm done with that. Let's move on to something else. It's a lifelong journey, and this is just the first few steps in understanding what my wife's been through, and I need to show love and compassion to her. And then I think that's the beginning of restoring some of the other things in the relationship.
Yeah. And I think every journey will be different for every couple. There's a couple of things you mentioned, Dale, but one of the things that I found unique to understanding, and when I came to a full comprehension with Michelle sharing what had gone on with her life, as I mentioned, was very well into our marriage when we had children. And it reminded me similar to a little bit of my story with, because I think sometimes as a spouse, you could take the possibility that my spouse is hiding something from me, and it could be a real negative in the relationship. It could cause the relationship to go a different direction. One of the things that helped me in understanding that, and just understanding that every survivor and victim is going to be different in how they get to that point where they're able to feel comfortable sharing with even someone as close as their spouse or a counselor or one of their best friends. Is it's going to take each person a little bit on a little bit different tack. But when I was young, my mother actually passed away when I was 3. She took her own life. My sister was 1, I was 3. And I did not find out about how she took her life until I was in college. And in looking back at that, I kind of draw the analogy that, my dad did not share with me exactly how she died. And I think there was a reason for that because at that young of an age, I might not have been able to understand that, to comprehend that. Could have taken me in a different direction in my life, one maybe with a lot of negativity. So when Michelle shared that with me, with it, what had happened to her, I was able in my mind to process that there's a season and a time for why God allows these things to occur. There's also a season and a time for when that person's ready to share and how they do share. And so that helped me. And so I think every journey for every couple is going to be different. And I think you do have to, as the spouse, the man, really show a lot of empathy as that begins to evolve and those things come forward. Because look, it's like the vows we made when we got married, for better or for worse, than sickness and in health. It doesn't say dealing with sexual abuse in those vows, but I think we can all agree that that's part of it. And what's the other option? The other option is to not move forward with the person you think God has put in your life for a reason. And so when I looked at it that way, and the commitment I had made to Michelle in the marriage, that I brought my own things that were part of my history to the marriage, and she hasn't said, well, that's too much for me. I'm ditching the effort here. We have to hold strong to the commitment that we feel like God has placed us in with the person that He's put in our lives. And so there was that element to why I think God was able to work through my life in trying to show empathy, because she'll tell you it's very hard for me sometimes to show empathy. I'm very stubborn. I like to see things move forward. I'm less like, let's move past that. We can get through this. But I think that's one of the things that God placed in my heart was a real place where I could show the empathy, be a helpmate to her, be comforting to her when she needed that. As she mentioned last week in the podcast, I haven't always said the right things or done the right things, but it's been a good process in helping us grow together. And so, yeah, I think every journey is gonna be different, but I do think as men, we have an obligation to not just lead the way the Bible tells us to lead and be the leaders of the household and things like that, but also to lead in a way that Jesus led, which was to show a lot of compassion and caring, empathy, loving those that need love right then. And so I think that's a way that sometimes men forget that they need to be leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the leadership part, maybe we can get into a little bit more in part 2, but I want to go into a little bit on one of the biggest responsibilities I think the husband has is to minister to his wife. And maybe we can get into that in our next segment.
Well, we really appreciate you both sharing how this has impacted your relationship and how you have let God help you in your roles as husbands of wives that have been impacted by abuse. So we look forward to having you again in our next podcast. We hope this podcast is a source of comfort and inspiration for those who are struggling with the aftermath of childhood sexual abuse. Thank you for joining us on this journey of hope and healing.
Please be sure to subscribe and check out our show notes for more information. See you next time on Conversations of Hope with Faith and Michelle.